Hello everybody and welcome to week 14 of our spring semester 2020 Social Work 140A. We're nearing the end and we're already on chapter 12, Activating Resources, which is a later stage of the process of the empowerment model. I wanted to tell you that this week is going to look as follows. I'm going to here in a moment give you some questions that I'm asking you to take a look at dealing with a vignette at the opening of chapter 12. I want to be able to spend some time looking at these questions and answering them when we are able to meet as a class on Zoom, and that would be on Thursday, April 23rd. We're going to go over those questions here in a moment. And then for the remainder of the time, I'm going to take a look at an outline of chapter 12. Chapter 12 is rather lengthy, and so I spent some time highlighting some of the major sections. So we're going to get to those. But as I mentioned, first, let's take a look at some of those questions that I'm hoping that we can discuss on Thursday. So as you've probably noticed or will notice in the very near future, chapter 12 describes a scenario involving John, a social worker, and Donna, a client. And my first question is, what prompted John and Donna to work together? Does Donna seem like she is more of a voluntary or involuntary client? Again, you might be able to build an argument one way or another on that. Number two, in conducting the assessment phase, what does John learn about Donna's personal strengths / capacities? Okay, there is a section in that scenario that describes some of the things that John learned about Donna, predictably when he was conducting the assessment phase. Number three, please identify the major goals of Donna's work with John. Now, this is where I differed with the book a little bit. I found it curious that in chapter 11 they describe goals as being largely vague and sweeping kind of statements, whereas the same thing that they identify, that they describe as goals here, are being labeled objectives in chapter 12. I think they're better described as goals, but the book calls them objectives. I found that kind of odd, but nonetheless, I think it's pretty clear when you start reading the vignette what the goals seem to be in the work between John and Donna. Number four, in what way does John advocate for Donna? How does he build support for his argument? You're going to notice at one point that John does advocate for Donna, and he does so in a very particular way. I'm kind of hoping that you're able to zero in on what that's about. Number five, what kind of interventions, some which you may have even used in our class, does John use with Donna? I find that kind of interesting and kind of a nice parallel because we have been doing work in class where we have considered a lot of different interventions, and I found it interesting that, even in this scenario, you can kind of find where it's useful for a social worker to use some of those interventions. Number six, for what reason does Donna meet with a TANF worker? What information does she receive from this meeting? Okay, that's actually a pretty clear point in the story. I do not think you'll have any trouble finding that one. Number seven, in what way does Donna's choice of employment match her strengths / capacities? That's, again, kind of one of those callbacks where you do an assessment of a client and as a social worker think, well, where does this person seem to kind of fit in the bigger scheme of things in terms of maybe employment if that's one of the goals? Okay. And finally, what would two objectives read like for Donna's case plan? This goes back to last week where we think about what objectives sound like. I think you'll recall I gave you some elements. You did it on an assignment. I'm just wondering what maybe two objectives would sound like in Donna's case plan. And I think you have enough evidence and enough supporting details in the scenario to figure that one out. So I hope you kind of have some fun with this. But my question of you today is if you would please be able to be prepared to talk about these questions when we meet as a class on Thursday. And now I've got some slides for you to take a look at. We are going to venture into the next part of our participation sheet for the beginning of this week. Beginning with Chapter 12, Activating Resources, and the first thing we're going to take a look at straight out of the chapter is a number of different content areas, beginning with maintaining progress in action plans. Now, we talked about in Chapter 11 how action plans are created with the goals and objectives of the work between the worker and the client. And now that we have the document in place, the question ultimately comes, how do we continue to maintain progress in action plans? The book has a number of different areas that it focuses on, beginning with implementing action plans and collaborating on actions. What do we have to say about this? Social workers and clients use in-person meetings and between meeting tasks to, here it is, keep moving toward goals. Okay, it's easy to stagnate. It's easy to get something done and then take it no further. That's not what you want to do here. Social work is an active process endeavor. We're trying to continue the process of moving toward change. The action plan is kind of our roadmap. That's what we're using to keep the client and our process with the client moving along. This can take place, as the text points out, with in-person meetings and also planning activities between tasks. Next, when you're meeting with clients, it provides you an opportunity to, here's the first one, experiment with new behaviors, observe the impact of change, or connect necessary resources. So a lot of times what you can do when you're having meetings with clients, and usually these are going to be mentioned in the objectives of your action plan, how often, how frequently, how long your meetings are, all those are mentioned as elements of objectives. You can talk to your clients about how they can experiment with new behavior, or they can report back to you what they've observed in terms of the impact of change, or you can agree that maybe you need to connect to some new necessary resources. But again, those are some kind of ways that the meetings that you're having with client based on action plans can kind of look like. Enhancing interactions, maintaining focus. Well, just like most things in life, without some kind of a solid focus, it's easy to stray. Social workers respectfully use questions to help clients to stay on course. I mentioned this last time too, how the action plan can, as I mentioned, be used as a roadmap, but also as a place for course correction, or if you decide, amending or changing objectives if it seems like it's necessary or appropriate. Social workers encourage clients to discuss one relevant issue before moving to another. Now, this takes some discipline, I got to admit. Just like the client could be bouncing around from topic to topic, social workers have a tendency to do something similar. It takes a little bit of discipline for the social worker to be able to look at the client and say, well, what seems to be most important here? And then once we kind of get there, maintaining some level of focus to work through the planning part of it before jumping to something else. And again, clients come to you in all states of disarray. Some actually can be much more focused, but the bottom line is if somebody's in a state of distress, it's very hard to remain focused, and the social worker is kind of almost like a surrogate for that. The social worker is like an external hard drive helping the client to store and process information. I think that's a function of the relationship in many ways. The book makes the point that larger systems make both of these tasks more difficult. Of course, as I mentioned here, there's more variables. Social workers, as a result, do well to be highly organized with items such as, here they are, among others. I mean, the book lists probably about 6, but I just put up a number here that I think are helpful. Written agendas, handouts, and audio-visual material. So it's almost like you're teaching a class in some ways. When you're meeting with clients that are in multi-person formats, it's useful to have a higher level of organization, because otherwise it's easy for you to get discombobulated. Uh, all of a sudden your attention gets scattered. You will begin to mirror the anxiety or the sense of kind of disorganization that the client's experiencing. It's better if you come in with some kind of structure. At least that's what I've found to be true. Encouraging participation. When we're talking about this, we go back to this notion that a lot of times clients are working with multi-person systems. What we're trying to get is all members are able to all able to participate, but also recognizing that not all members contribute equally. That's the blank space. In other words, as I state here, why all members are able to participate, not all members contribute equally. That's the nature of it. But the important thing is having everyone contributing. Stimulating support within client systems. How can this take place? Well, social workers can take actions to recognize and establish alliances among clients. The book talks about this in the context of, for example, family therapy. That's among many others. But for example, if you were asking in a family if you could meet with just the parents, you're almost symbolically recognizing that there's an alliance here, or there ideally should be an alliance there. Just by asking to meet with them, you're reflecting and recognizing, and also you could say taking steps to establish an alliance among clients. This can be very powerful, helping to support and establish alliances among clients. Handling differences. Any place you find humans, you're going to find differences. I think that's just it'd be almost weird if you didn't find that. Excuse me. I think that there's many ways, and the book gives us quite a few. I thought they were kind of helpful, of using specific kind of targeted questions or statements to handle differences. That's on page 305. Another way I like to look at it is this. On the Supreme Court, we have 9 justices, and they may disagree. So one phrase that I frequently heard being uttered in the legal context is reasonable minds can differ. And I thought that's beautiful. Reasonable minds can differ. People who are reasonable can have different ideas about the same thing. I think that's not a bad thing to say when you're working with more than one person and you notice that disagreements arise. I think it's not a bad thing to be able to say that. So handling differences, okay, social workers can help in this area by ensuring that opposing views are recognized and summarized. That's another little technique. Sometimes when you're working with people with opposing views, you can ask somebody who's clearly on an opposite side to report what they heard the other person say. And then you can ask the person who originally made the statement, is that what you said? And they can correct. But bottom line is that it begins a process of managing any kind of conflict or difficulties or differences in a constructive fashion. Next, we're going to move on to sustaining motivation, which is the next item here. Motivation is something that can waver, as you know. Maybe that's happened to your own sense of motivation throughout the course of a semester in school. Who knows? We frequently experience fluctuation in motivation, emotions, all kinds of things as being a human. At the same time, ways that you can validate and you can kind of help people continue their momentum is when you validate a client's reality. This may be the first time this has ever happened for a client. A lot of times they feel dismissed. They feel they feel basically like second-class citizens. They feel marginalized. The social worker, in validating a client's reality, holds a very powerful context to engage the client with. Here's a long one for you, but I'm sure you got some. Here goes some blank spaces we can fill in. Social workers can recognize and discuss with clients oppressive forces, including institutionalized racism, discrimination, or economic disparities, which can validate a client's worldview. In other words, the client might be kind of saying, well, you mean I'm not crazy? No, actually, you're not. And a lot of these same things are going on for other people as well. And perhaps we can help you direct, some of your energy into fighting it. That's something that can help people feel empowered, no longer hopeless. Okay. Validating clients' worldview. Social workers normalize. That's the word we're looking for here at the blank spot. Social workers normalize the experience of clients. Again, back to this notion that you're letting the clients know, no, it's not just you. It's not just you. The word that you frequently hear associated with this type of behavior for social workers is normalizing the experience of clients. Accepting the nature of change. It's very easy for clients to, and even social workers, to feel discouraged when change doesn't seem to be happening very quickly. But I think that's an invitation for the social worker to remain in his, her, or their own skin and not feel daunted by the whole thing. I like the way that the book puts this. I kind of referenced it straight out of the text. It is rare that change occurs in a predictable way. Boy, isn't that the truth. Thus, social workers do well to celebrate even, there it is, incremental changes. So there's your blank. Incremental changes, and remain optimistic when working with clients. I'm not kidding you. Some days are going to feel much better or much worse than others. And it's just the nature of change. It's just the way things are. Respecting uniqueness. I think social workers do this better than most people. At least our curriculum really focuses on us to do this. Relying on standard techniques or cookbook interventions can fail to acknowledge the unique qualities and needs of clients. So you may have the best technique or the latest up-and-coming model or approach to working with people, but it doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody. It also may or may not reflect and respect the cultural identities or needs of the client base you're working with. So I would say that techniques and interventions, especially when they've been evidence-based, are really good, strong approaches for social workers to use. And they're not always the be-all, end-all. I think social workers are in a much better position to consider how the intervention or the technique works with the specific clients that you're working with. It's not a safe assumption to believe that it's a one-size-fits-all world. Different people have very different needs. So I think that being able to consider beyond just the technique, but the unique qualities and needs of the client to be just as valuable. Well, I've said this a number of times throughout the semester. Openly discussing and accepting differences can reinforce working alliances. It doesn't hurt at all. In fact, it only helps to be able to recognize that differences can actually occur, and you might not have the same experience as your clients, and you can recognize that, and you can respect them as unique and say, well, I haven't had your experience, but I sure would like to hear about it. So I think that's one way you can respect uniqueness. And that goes along with this whole notion that once you understand another person's uniqueness, you're in a better position to make decisions about what's an appropriate intervention. Match the client's cultural experience. Social work strategies which respect and fit clients' culture and worldview tend to work most effectively. Yeah, people are going to be a lot more apt to engage things they're familiar with or at least fit with their realities. When you employ strategies to work with clients, as close as you can tailor them to fit clients' culture and worldviews, the better. I mean, that's one of those comments that almost seems obvious, and yet at the same time, we can get really lost in the details or the science or the research behind something and say, well, this must be the next best thing. Well, yeah, okay, but if it doesn't match with a client's worldview or culture, it may be kind of useless to both of you. Providing emotional support. Okay. The book mentions 2 ways social workers provide emotional support, and the first one was social workers provide emotional support through 1, complimenting clients on change and giving them credit, and 2, selectively. Now I put that there on purpose, selectively sharing their emotions about working with clients. We don't want you sharing your emotions for you. We could turn your work into a therapy session for you, but that's not serving the client. That's why this next comment is useful. However, I think actually that was supposed to be B. That was supposed to be the B, not the 6. So think of this 6 as a B, and moved over a little bit. The second example, which is selectively sharing emotions, should be in service to the client rather than the social worker. That's absolutely imperative. Okay. The book then moves on to this notion of developing power in clients. First way in doing so is promoting leadership. And the book actually very constructively states that at the micro level, social workers may assist individuals gaining skills in assertiveness, supporting parental authority and decision making. I know that's kind of a long one, so sorry about the short space. You might have to space that out. Or encouraging initiative to take charge. So especially if you're working in a small group and you're encouraging people who seem to have natural leadership skills to begin to take charge, that in and of itself is an intervention. And I think that that's a way that you can activate resources, is by kind of tapping into somebody's natural resources to lead, even if they don't believe they have them, but you can see them. Number 2, at the meso level, organizations may implement consensus planning. Remember that one? Okay, we're trying to get everyone's voice involved. Elevating voices. So if there's more of a minority view in a group, making sure that you are able to advocate for it, give it space, okay, taking time. These are all powerful ways to promote leadership. And developing potential leadership of stakeholders. That's within organizations. Okay. It should be at the macro level. Sorry for the error there. At the macro level, relevant skill sets may include public speaking, legislative testimony, and social networking. So again, all these at various levels are ways that social workers can help to promote leadership among the client base. Okay. Facilitating choices. Social workers counter client feelings of powerlessness by helping them recognize situations that they could realistically change. Okay. This is not to paint a overly rosy picture of every situation and say, well, you know, if you have a spinal cord injury, there's a really great chance you're not going to walk again, depending on the severity. But if that's the case, then what are some realistic changes that can be made about the situation that can be empowering for the client? Clients may be able to see choices where they previously saw no options. In this context, solution-focused questions can be highly useful. Actually, I found this to be quite a useful part of our book, and this is actually between pages 308 and 309. Looking at the bottom here on 308, it says social workers may ask the following: what are you thinking that you would like to do? In deciding to stay, what actions can you take to help you feel safer? How can you best protect your children? And this is all in the context of a domestic violence relationship. But again, the reason why I'm asking these questions in connection with this second item here is a lot of times when you meet with people, they really don't even understand that they have choices. They don't see any other options. As a social worker, we're in a prime position to be able to help point out that options do exist and that they may have more choices than they thought. Here's some more questions. What choices do you feel are available to you? If you were to leave the relationship, what resources and supports would you need to be successful on your own? What are you hoping will happen in the long term as we move forward? What do you need from me to help you get to where you want to go? Those are all solution focused. Every one of those questions is solution focused in one way or another. So again, facilitating choices is a very strong role for social workers in helping clients develop their power. Because again, if you don't see options, you are in fact disempowered. You can't see anything other than one way, and if it's making you suffer, it can be a pretty harrowing experience. Clients frequently lack, here's the blank space, information about what resources are available and how to, here's the next one, activate them. Helping clients in this area expands their freedom to choose. Okay, again, we're talking about folks who really have lived in such a way that they don't see any other choices, no other options. It can be incredibly liberating and power and engage feelings of power, engender feelings of powerfulness when they feel like they've got choices. Shaping competence. Social workers promote client power through accentuating their strengths, including, and again, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that strengths can be qualities. They don't have to just be tangible things. They can be people's abilities to adapt to situations. Here's a couple: optimism, creativity, cultural identities, competent relationships. There's a number of other areas that are mentioned in the book, and I believe that's on page 309. You can look at it if I'm expecting that you probably already have or will be soon, but these are all different ways that social workers can shine a light on strengths that can be accentuated. Client strengths may be illustrated in desperate circumstances. Social workers may choose to use a positive, here's your blank space, positive asset search to scan for resources that are present within and around clients. This may even be found in conflicted families where one member acknowledges and reflects the opposing view expressed by another member. Highlighting this behavior often helps encourage it in others as well. So when you can get one person rolling in a different direction, or if you start to spot somebody beginning to do something a little different, and you as the social worker highlight it, a lot of times what you do is you encourage it from the same person, but you also encourage it from other people in the group just by paying attention to it and saying it out loud. The positive asset search, I love that because there's all these like high-end books that you can buy for people who are in business where they're trying to help cultivate leaders. Strength, what is there? There's a book called like Strengths Finder 2.0, that type of thing. I don't see why we can't use those type of techniques with our clients. I think it's just as helpful. You don't have to be in a Fortune 500 company to use some of these ways of highlighting people's strengths. In fact, I think we need it even more where we're at than maybe other places. So, excuse me. That's another way to kind of help bring about change, shaping competence by, in fact, acknowledging it.
For the next part, we're going to begin talking about a section of our chapter called Changing Perspective. And this is when we are actively working directly with clients, helping them examine parts about their responses to things currently going on or things that have gone on in the past. It's a very powerful way to work with clients. Changing perspective starts like this. One of the things that we're in a prime spot to give clients is feedback. That's one thing we're able to give back pretty readily. Offering feedback, our book talks about how you do that and the importance of it. Social workers, beginning with your sheet, returning to your sheet now, social workers offer feedback to allow clients to, here's your first blank, reflect on their behavior, and next blank, choose how they want to act. Okay, that's the basic structure of what feedback can do. In addition, social workers may assess a client's level of, here's the blank, trust. I'm sorry, a level of trust should be a comma there. Ability to articulate ideas, okay, patience, persistence, sense of humor, and creativity. These are all the things that when you're giving feedback to clients, you can get a little bit of a read on. Helps you understand them and probably helps them understand themselves when they are interacting with you. When you construct feedback, our book gives a little bit of structure to this as well. Begins with a question: can I give you some feedback? That's a wonderful way to break up, especially if you have a client who's continuing to talk and you need to summarize, or you want to kind of just put some gaps in to slow things down a little bit, or you feel like it is a really opportune time to give the client some feedback. You can just ask a question. Can I give you some feedback? Okay. Introduces a worker's observations. I have noticed that when blank, the response is to blank. Okay. Again, keeping it neutral, keeping it free from judgment. It's more like you're, an observing eye. Again, just something that is, again, fairly neutral. Provide social workers experience. You can also throw in there what's encouraging to work with someone who takes risks, or you could say it's refreshing to see somebody who's so candid. It's a pleasure to work with somebody who has this much motivation. That can all be part of the feedback loop. Confronting in a supportive way. Confrontation is sometimes necessary. However, most folks who come into the field of social work either are okay with it or are uncomfortable with it. I mean, it's usually somewhere on either side of the spectrum. But I think there's a little bit of an art to confrontation. I think there's also a timing to confrontation, but nonetheless, our book gives us some guidance. When it comes to confronting in a supportive way, the book states it includes 3 parts: the intent, the behavior, and the outcome. And again, this is very much like the constructing feedback, especially B that I just gave you in the preceding item. If you are observing someone's behavior and you are reflecting back what their intent is, okay, you can do that fairly neutrally. You could even ask it in a question: did I get this right, that it's your intent that you want this to happen? Okay. Well, the behavior I'm seeing is this happening here and now, and this is what I'm seeing you do, or this is what I've seen done, and here's the outcome. Okay. Does it feel like that's getting where you want things to be? Does that feel like that's what you were intending to happen? And if the client says no, the intent may be the same, but the behaviors may be problematic. Now, there's lots and lots of ways to address behavior, and that's where this chapter kind of heads after this, which I think this chapter is constructed pretty well. I like chapter 12 for a number of reasons, but that's kind of the roadmap here. A lot of times we can keep the intent. We might not like the outcome, but we see that the common denominator is the behavior. And I think even sometimes the gap between the intent and the behavior involves a certain level of thinking on the part of the client, or I should say interpreting on the part of the client. And that's what the next part's kind of getting into. But nonetheless, let's keep going along. The book also cautions workers use confronting strategies, here's your blank, selectively, and usually after they have developed a great deal of rapport with the client or client system. I cannot stress that enough. There are some things that you can say with a client or a client system later in the relationship that just would not be appropriate earlier on. That's what I was referring to earlier when I said timing. There's just some things that if they're hard and they're important, it sometimes is better to just wait. You might file it under address this later. If you're noticing it earlier on in the relationship, it takes a while sometimes to get to a point where it's appropriate to go ahead and confront something, even in a supportive way. Okay. Well, I guess I didn't really do a good job putting the animation on this next slide. It just appeared. That's on me, but nonetheless, let's just go through it. Okay. The next portion, trailing on what I just got done talking about, was creating new concepts. The first one that the book talks about is modifying thoughts and beliefs. Now, I just talked about that gap between intent and behaviors. I think it sometimes is filled with thoughts and beliefs. Here's where we are on your participation sheet. Okay. Human behavior does not exist in a vacuum. It involves a sequence of events. Experiences prompt a, here's your blank, cognitive response, which derives its meaning. From there, we behave according to our meaning. So in other words, usually something is going to begin with a thought or a perception before it transfers into a feeling and a behavior. Since there are multiple ways to interpret experiences, cognitive behavioral therapy, and I mentioned this, it was last week or the week before, a book I like to read, okay, can be employed to help clients examine their own perceptions and explore multiple ways of interpreting the same experience, and consequently modify their behavior. So again, this particular kind of therapy and this particular paradigm is premised by the belief that when we behave a certain way, it is usually preceded by some kind of a thinking or perception, and specifically a meaning about what we're seeing. It's just response to stimuli. Okay. Our text points out that this can be particularly important in working with clients who have experienced trauma, because of course the meaning of trauma for people can have life rippling effects. So the way that you interpret trauma, if you've been through it, really does affect the way you're going to behave. Excuse me. Reframing is the next portion. In addition to modifying thoughts and beliefs, social workers can be therapists, but they don't have to be. Social workers are in a prime spot to help with reframing. This approach entails examining a situation that was previously perceived as negative, and providing a more constructive perspective about it, which is positive, functional, or useful. So here's your blanks: positive, functional, or useful. Okay. In this way, the responses determine the meaning. Okay. Again, back to that whole notion about meaning. Humans are meaning-making creatures. Entire books were written about this. Okay. The next portion is using metaphors. Some people are really good at this. This is where you're basically, in a way, this is an active summary. You're basically describing what you've heard in kind of a portmanteau. You're kind of condensing everything into a metaphor. Our book uses a lot of, and I'll get to that in a minute, using metaphors. This method reframes situations in a way that allows for reorientation toward a perception and affects the way clients think and feel and respond to it. Now, our book gives us some examples. This is on page 313. It says right here, when social workers and clients, I'm at the top, seek to articulate feelings, workers use wording such as the following: you feel as if you are out on a limb. That's a metaphor. So it's kind of like here's another example. So it's kind of like you're drifting in the middle of a lake, not really getting anywhere. And a third one: seems as if you've hit rock bottom. All of those are metaphors, but they summarize what the social worker has taken in as the client's perspective. And it reframes it in a package that is visual, being out on a limb, being in the middle of a lake, hitting rock bottom, and then allows for a continuation that can be reframing. It can be positive. So it says on the next portion down, building on these same metaphors, social workers can offer hopeful direction as the following. Well, maybe it's time to edge back toward the trunk. That's what the one about being out on the limb. So as you are drifting, what do you see that catches your interest? Okay, that's an interesting way of saying, well, if you're floating in the middle of a lake and you're there, if you look around, what is kind of capturing your attention? And finally, now that you're at the bottom, and at least there's only one way to go, what's the first thing that needs to happen to pick yourself back up? Again, all of these are kind of spins on metaphors that help gain some traction for the client to maybe review or revise their perception about what they're in. And again, the metaphor is kind of the engine for all of that. So that's why metaphors can be so strikingly powerful. The next portion of the book is called Using Narrative Strategies, and I'm going to hold off on that for a minute because it's again it's lengthy, and it's kind of detailed. I mean, it does a lot with narrative therapy. I'm going to come back to that at a later time, maybe in the form of a discussion. But for right now, you have quite a bit. I want to remind you about the exam number 2, which I know you're working on. Some of you may have even started or finished it. And we're going to keep going with this Thursday meeting on Zoom. And that's April 23rd. And at that time, I'm going to return to those questions that I asked at the beginning. So my hope is that in addition to going through all this slideshow, part of today's activity for you is going back and looking at those questions, considering the vignette at the beginning of chapter 12, and reflecting and responding to the questions so that we have some things to discuss when we meet on Thursday. So until then, be safe, take care of yourselves, and I will look forward to seeing you on Zoom on Thursday.